I caught my husband and my sister in the storage room. I locked the door and called her husband. For years I believed I lived a stable life, surrounded by love and trust. My marriage seemed solid, and my relationship with my sister was one of complicity. But gradually small signs began to erode my peace. When I realized it, I was no longer the protagonist of my own story, and what was hidden before my eyes was bigger than I imagined. What came next required coldness, courage, and a strength I didn't know I had. This is the story of a woman betrayed by those she loved most, but who chose not to seek revenge, but rather to free herself. I'm happy to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment with the city you are watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. Waking up next to Matthew was like watching a rehearsed play. The morning kisses, the coffee brewed exactly how I liked it, and the light touch on my shoulder before he left for work. Everything seemed too perfect. Emily, my younger sister, visited us frequently, always bringing flowers or some dessert she said she made with me in mind. I should have felt grateful, wrapped in this harmonious routine, but something inside me retreated in silence. It was as if my body sensed invisible cracks that my mind insisted on ignoring. As the weeks passed, this feeling did not disappear, it grew. Matthew started arriving a little later, with plausible excuses but with a look that didn't match his story. Emily offered to help more often, as if she wanted to occupy spaces that previously belonged only to me. I began to feel like I was being pushed out of my own life, as if I were a spectator and not the protagonist of my story. Even at dinners, my name seemed to echo less frequently. I smiled on the outside, but on the inside I felt out of place in my own home. I began to observe small gestures with redoubled attention. The looks they exchanged when they thought I wasn't watching. The way Matthew became tense when Emily showed up unannounced. It wasn't a scandal or drama, it was silence. And in that silence there was much more noise than in any fight. I began to rethink every recent memory, questioning whether what I saw was real, or just what I wanted to see. What if I was being deceived right before my own eyes? Even so, I kept smiling, pretending everything was fine. Until one afternoon, while picking up my phone to look at old photos, I noticed that some messages had disappeared. Not my messages, but Matthew's, deleted from the history. Something about that absence hurt more than an offensive word. It was as if they were hiding pieces of my life. Was I ignoring the obvious? The following week, Matthew's absences became even more frequent. He said the projects at the office were piling up, but he no longer brought home blueprints or comments about clients. It seemed that his professional world ceased to exist when he crossed the front door. Emily, on the other hand, now arrived even before I got home from work. Her clothes were hanging in my bathroom, as if she were a permanent resident. All of this went unnoticed by those watching from the outside. Only I felt the disconnection. I started feeling like a decorative piece in the house I built. The dishes were washed, the food was in the oven, the rooms were tidy, but I wasn't really there. My presence had become symbolic, as if my function was only to keep the environment in order so that others could live comfortably. With every gesture of affection from Emily or accidental touch from Matthew, my stomach turned. My intuition screamed, but my reason still sought concrete evidence. It was on a Sunday afternoon that I saw something that confirmed my suspicions. Matthew went out to buy wine, and left his phone on the table, locked as usual. But a notification appeared. It was from Emily. The message disappeared in seconds, as if it had been sent and then deleted. What would a sister say to her brother-in-law that I couldn't read? This small gesture had the weight of an avalanche. At that moment I realized the problem wasn't just my insecurity. It was no longer worth justifying the silences with affection or the absences with work. Those two were in some silent dance, and I was the only one who didn't hear the music. The deleted messages were not a coincidence. On Monday I arrived home early. Emily was in the living room, her back turned, wearing a gray coat that looked all too familiar. The scent hit me before the recognition. It was Matthew's cologne. At first I tried to rationalize, maybe he had lent it to her, maybe it was similar. But when I asked to see the coat up close, she hesitated for a second. That was enough to make my heart race. In the pocket, something metallic sparkled. I pulled the object out as if pulling up a buried truth. It was an earring. A small golden circle with an amber stone. I had known that earring since adolescence. It was part of a set Emily received from our mother. It wasn't something that could have been forgotten by accident. Matthew would never have that earring in his pocket if he hadn't been with her in an intimate way. That was more than proof. It was a silent confession. Emily tried to change the subject. She said she was cold and had borrowed the coat, but she didn't explain the earring. She didn't even try. Her eyes didn't seek mine, and her voice became muffled. I stood there motionless, holding that small piece of metal as if it were a blade cutting through my memories. Suddenly, everything I had ignored took a concrete shape. There was no turning back. Doubt transformed into palpable pain, and with it the beginning of something new. The desire to see the truth exposed. I knew that earring. It belonged to my sister. 2 days later, Matthew appeared in the bedroom with a semi-open suitcase and a hurried smile. He said an urgent conference in Denver required his presence. The overly casual tone contrasted with the haste in his eyes. I asked for details, and he stammered the name of a hotel he had never mentioned before. Something in the way he pronounced every word seemed rehearsed, as if he had practiced in front of the mirror. I took a deep breath, trying to act natural. He barely looked me in the eyes as he left. He didn't ask me to go with him, nor did he make the usual gesture of an affectionate goodbye. For the first time, the suitcase seemed lighter than what he was carrying on his conscience. When I heard the car engine fading away, my body reacted with an involuntary tremor. I went into the bedroom, turned on the computer, and typed in the name of the hotel. No reservation made. No event listed. No Matthew Sullivan staying there that week. I confirmed on travel sites, professional social networks, and even discreetly called the hotel reception. Nothing. There was no ticket, no event, no justification. It was a poorly constructed lie, sustained by my old trust. I realized he no longer bothered to hide things with precision. His confidence came from the certainty that I wouldn't look. And it was at that exact moment that I decided I would no longer be predictable. There were no tickets, no reservations. The next day, I told Matthew via message that I would also be traveling that weekend. I invented a literature congress in another city. He responded only with a good luck and a book emoji. That surprised me more than any lie. He didn't even question it. He didn't ask about the location, the times, or if I would need help. It was as if he really wanted me to go. As if I were finally leaving the path clear. I packed my suitcase as he did, with clothes I wouldn't use, and left only to circle the block. I returned at nightfall and parked the car 2 streets away. I spent the night at a friend's house who had offered me shelter without asking questions. In the morning, I hid behind a newspaper in the corner coffee shop, watching my own street. I was an investigator in my own life. And what shocked me most was how easy it was to deceive him. His confidence in my passivity was so great that he didn't even consider the possibility of me being suspicious. For the first time, I saw that I had an advantage. He no longer saw me as a threat. And that was what made me more dangerous. He believed it too easily. I waited for the day to pass, distracting myself with books and iced tea. But my heart tightened every minute. At 6 in the evening, I walked discreetly to my house. Matthew's car was not in the garage, which was expected. But another vehicle caught my attention. An old red model with a bumper sticker I knew well. Emily's car. I stood still, feeling my blood run hot and cold at the same time. The car was there, out in the open like a signature on the crime. I went to the fence and saw through the window that the lights were on, and shadows were passing through the kitchen. Muffled laughter. A plate being placed on the table. My dinner in my house prepared for 2. My hands were shaking, but my feet were firm. There on that sidewalk, I realized that none of this was new. It wasn't an impulse. It wasn't a recent passion. It was a habit. It was a routine. And worse, it was happening with my permission while I pretended that my life was still mine. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a routine. The day after the fake trip, I decided to follow them. Without haste, without fanfare. I parked far enough away not to be noticed, but close enough to see the gestures I had previously only imagined. They walked side by side, hands almost touching, looks exchanged as if they were in a universe where I didn't exist. They entered a cafe that Matthew and I used to frequent. The table in the corner, where I celebrated our anniversaries, now served as a stage for new smiles. And this time I was prepared. I recorded everything. With my phone hidden between the pages of a book, I captured soft kisses, intertwined hands, and touches under the table. No sign of guilt, no look over the shoulder. They behaved like a consolidated couple, as if the world had accepted that clandestine love. I, on the outside of the window, felt as if I were watching the staging of my own pain. Every click of the camera was a message for the future. I was no longer blind. I followed them to a park, where they sat together on a bench, sharing a pair of headphones. They laughed at something on the phone, so complicit, so oblivious to the suffering they were leaving behind. As I watched that, what hurt most was not the betrayal, it was the naturalness of it. They weren't afraid. They didn't think they needed to hide. I was just a shadow in their lives, erased for convenience. And that showed me how much they relied on my passivity. But I was no longer the same. The Rebecca who trusted blindly had disappeared on that sidewalk the night before. Now every image, every frame was a part of the puzzle that I would assemble calmly. They felt too safe. I returned home with the photos on my phone and a frightening calm. While making coffee, I opened my laptop and accessed the bank account Matthew thought I never used. I discovered hotel reservations in his name, but always for 2 guests. I saw receipts for dinners in neighboring cities, duplicate gifts, and taxi rides to places where he never took me. The dates matched his absences, and most cruelly, the days when Emily also disappeared. With every click, the details took shape. A bracelet bought from a jewelry store where I took Emily last Christmas. An expensive dinner recorded on a weekend when Matthew said he was working late. The pattern was clear. The two were living a parallel life funded by my ingenuity. And now I had the receipts. The betrayal was where he least imagined I would look. In the numbers. Seeing the records didn't bring the pain I expected. On the contrary, I felt a silent strength growing within me. It was as if, by transforming intuition into concrete proof, I regained control. Doubt no longer existed. There was no way to deny it. There was no room for confused explanations or rehearsed excuses. I had the facts. And now it was a matter of deciding what I would do with them. Everything made sense. The averted looks, the changed clothes, the silences in the early hours of the morning. The pieces fit together like in a tragic novel that I didn't write, but now needed to conclude. The betrayal was documented. Instead of a confrontation, I took a deep breath and began to print everything. Photos, statements, emails, receipts. I put together a blue folder, the kind we use in school to organize students' exams. But there, the content was the proof of the end of a marriage. I categorized everything with dates, locations, and even my own notes on what I witnessed. I didn't want chaos. I wanted logic. I wanted them to have nowhere to run when they saw it. I kept the folder in a locked drawer, and that night, I slept for the first time without tears. Not because the pain had passed, but because the clarity gave me peace. I knew I didn't need to rush. Time was on my side. And more than that, my posture would make them doubt my awareness. This gave me an advantage. They didn't know how much I knew. And that was gold. I began treating them with more coldness, but without losing my politeness. Emotional distance was my shield. Emily kept coming over, but now I observed her with the eyes of someone who no longer saw her as a sister. Matthew kissed me on the forehead, and I imagined his face when he saw every piece of evidence I collected. But all of that was still not enough. I wanted more. I wanted the truth to swallow them whole, in front of everyone. And it was there, between organized papers and calculated silences, that I realized I was not seeking revenge. I wanted liberation. It was the beginning of something greater than anger. The following week, I scheduled my first session with Dr. Helen Moore. Her office was sober but welcoming, as if it had been made for people on the verge of a collapse. I sat before her, silent, holding the cup of tea as if it were an anchor. I didn't cry. I didn't explode. I simply told the facts. One by one. She didn't react with shock, but with respect. Every pause of mine was met with her presence. She heard me talk about Emily, about Matthew, about the muffled laughter in the bank records. When I finished, she said only, "You don't need to react with anger. You need to act with truth." Her words were like a breath that cleared the fog. For the first time, someone didn't try to comfort me, they tried to give me back my power. And I knew right there that my war would have a strategy, not a scandal. The conversation lasted for an hour, but it felt like it had lasted a lifetime. When I left the office, I felt my body was light. I walked through the streets like someone who had just woken up from a long dream. I wasn't crazy. I was betrayed. And more than that, I was awake. Dr. Moore made me see that the exposure was not about revenge. It was about freeing myself from the prison of silence. And as I walked into my house that night, something inside me had already changed. The plan was no longer an emotional impulse. It became a project. And I would be its architect. You don't need to react with anger. You need to act with truth. On Tuesday, Matthew casually mentioned that he would have another trip over the weekend. A congress in a coastal city with renowned architects. I smiled, wished him good luck, and asked if he needed me to take care of anything at home. He thanked me, visibly relieved. I already knew. This would be the final stage of the performance. And this time I would be the one writing the script. I told him that I would also have a trip, a teacher's retreat organized by the school. I packed my bags, left visible notes, and even a back Sunday sticky note on the mirror. Everything was very credible, very clean as always. He seemed calm, almost excited, as if he were about to gain a weekend of freedom. Little did he know that the stage was already being set. While he left for work, I began to act. I cleaned the house, organized the rooms, and left the guest room perfectly tidy, as if it had been unoccupied for days. I bought fresh flowers, as I always did before a trip. Everything had to look absolutely real. The final detail would be invisible to his eyes, but fundamental, because this time the performance would be filmed. It was time to set up the emotional crime scene. The next day, I went to a specialty store and bought a discreet security camera, small with no visible wires, controlled by an app. I tested all the angles and chose the corner of the living room bookshelf, where I would have a clear view of the entrance, the stairs, and the sofa. The lens fit inside a wooden ornament that no one would ever suspect. I configured it to record only when there was movement. Everything was ready. I also positioned an audio recorder in the living room lamp. That environment would be the heart of the revelation. I knew that there, relaxed, they would exchange kisses and perhaps promises. I wanted to record the naturalness of the betrayal, so that no one could ever say it was a mistake. I wanted every second to be clear, audible, and undeniable. The truth needed to be seen and heard. With the house prepared, I left on Saturday morning as if I were really going to the retreat. I parked in a neighboring city, at the apartment of a friend who was traveling. From there, I controlled everything via my cell phone, watching the first movements of the play that I had rehearsed myself. The stage was set, the lights were on, and the actors were entering the scene. Matthew would never imagine that this would be the last comfortable lie. They would never imagine what awaited them. It was Saturday afternoon when the front door opened with Matthew's key. I watched everything on my phone, my heart pulsing at the exact rhythm of silent revenge. Emily entered first, laughing at something he whispered in her ear. Her laughter echoed through the rooms like indecent music. My home, the same one where I grew up with her, was now the stage for the most intimate of betrayals. They were so comfortable that they seemed to belong in that scene. They took off their coats, walked through the house, and opened the refrigerator as if it were routine. Every gesture of theirs screamed habit. They sat on the sofa and laughed, intertwined, as if they were in their own apartment. It was a theater of horrors, and I, even from a distance, was in the front row. They didn't know it, but the curtain had already begun to fall. They went up the stairs holding hands and entered the guest room. It was the space I had prepared with care, the one that seemed like a shelter, but which, at that moment, was transformed into a trap. As soon as I heard the door close and the sounds fall silent, I activated the remote command. The lock engaged. They were trapped. And I was on the other side of the city with the control in my hands. For months I was the deceived woman, the betrayed sister. Now I was the author of the plot. Her laughter echoed like stabs. The first few minutes were silent. Then came the nervous footsteps, the sound of the doorknob being turned, and Emily's voice asking if he had locked it by mistake. Matthew grumbled something but soon tried to appear calm. They didn't know yet, but they were being recorded. Every word, every attempt to justify that encounter would be documented. The truth would no longer have any way to escape. Emily began to get nervous. She asked if anyone had seen them. Matthew tried to reassure her, saying that I was in another city and that nothing would go wrong. It was then that her phone rang. She saw my name on the screen and by reflex answered. On the other end of the line, my voice was firm without a tremor. Look around you. Everything you do or say now is being recorded. And I hung up. The silence after my call was almost audible, even from a distance. They knew. They felt it in their bodies. The room once a refuge became a cell. The camera continued steadily, capturing every second. Matthew tried to force the door, but it was useless. Emily cried softly. There were no more excuses, no escape routes. For the first time, they were face to face with what they really were. Accomplices in my destruction. And I, for the first time in months, did not feel fragile. Finally, they were trapped together in the truth. With the security of someone who holds the truth, I picked up my phone and dialed Eric. The call took a few seconds to go through, long dense seconds. When he answered, his voice sounded tired, as if he already suspected everything but didn't want to name it. I asked him to come to my house. I didn't give explanations, I didn't need to. He simply replied, "I'm on my way," and hung up. While I waited, I sat on the sofa at my friend's house watching the camera screen. Emily was huddled in a corner of the bed, while Matthew walked back and forth, murmuring phrases that even he didn't believe. The truth had reached them without warning, without a chance to escape. And what was to come was even more definitive. Eric was the last piece, the only one who still needed to see it with his own eyes. Because hearing it would not be enough. Suspecting it was not enough. He needed to see, feel, and understand. The pain shared between us was no longer invisible. It was real, solid, and soon it would be impossible to ignore. The moment of the final confrontation was approaching. He needed to see it with his own eyes. Eric arrived less than 40 minutes later. I opened the door in silence, my face firm and my eyes tired of waiting so long for intimate justice. He looked at me as if he already knew what was about to happen, but still didn't have the courage to accept it. There were no hugs, no questions. Only the shared pain of two people betrayed by the same bond. I pointed to the living room, where the monitor displayed the live recording. I handed him the control for the room, with the digital key ready to unlock the door. His hands were shaking slightly. For a moment I thought about saying something, but I preferred silence. The weight of that moment demanded respect. Eric watched the screen like someone staring into an abyss about to swallow everything he knew. Without saying a word, he pressed the button. On the monitor, we heard the click of the lock being released. Matthew stopped immediately. Emily raised her head, her eyes red. When the door opened, there were no words, only the sound of the world collapsing. Eric entered and found them there, together, in a scene that can never be erased. He stood still, looking at the bed, at their faces, at everything that was destroyed without him realizing it. The pain etched on his face was the same that had been burning inside me for weeks. And it was then that Emily tried to approach. She stammered something, reaching out her hand, but Eric took a step back. His look was final. He trembled but held his ground. Emily tried to explain between sobs and shallow justifications. She said she didn't know how it happened, that she was confused, and that Matthew understood her like no one else. He in turn remained silent. There was no longer any possible narrative. Words could not cover the filth of that act. I remained in the living room, hearing everything, my chest tight but my eyes dry. The pain had been overcome by certainty. Eric collapsed onto the sofa with his hands over his face. It was as if the air had been pulled out of the room. Emily knelt before him, trying to touch him, but he pushed her away with a short gesture. He said only, "Don't try." The short phrase, toneless, carried more weight than any scream. She was crying, but it was too late. Too late to pretend, too late to hide. Matthew finally broke the silence. He sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped, and said in a low voice, "It's been 8 months." Eric stared at him for a few seconds. The silence that followed was unbearable. 8 months. Enough time to plan, repeat, and hide. Enough time to destroy 2 marriages and an entire family. None of us said anything else. It wasn't necessary. The truth was naked, without makeup, exposed before everyone. It was too late for apologies. I got up from the armchair and walked to the door. The air was thick, but my heart beat with a strength I hadn't felt in a long time. I looked Eric in the eyes and he just nodded. Without saying a word, he walked to the door, passing by me like someone crossing a battlefield. He didn't look back. He didn't say goodbye. He just left, taking with him the last pieces of something that was once love. Matthew didn't stop him. Emily didn't follow him. The house fell into absolute silence. The kind of silence that remains when there are no more excuses, no justifications, and no bonds. Only ruins. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just took a deep breath and closed the door, like someone closing a chapter without haste. Everything was recorded. Everything was confirmed. And now, finally, everyone knew what was going on behind the perfect routine. The room remained open, the camera turned off. The mask had fallen. And from then on, nothing would ever be the same. Freedom would come, but there would still be more to face. More truths to expose. More steps to take. But at that moment, a part of the weight had already been torn away. Eric left the house without looking back. The idea for the dinner arose like a whisper in my mind. A silent need to close the cycle with everyone present. I sent the invitations delicately, like someone preparing any other celebration. Intimate dinner for family and close friends, the message said. No one suspected anything. Some even praised the initiative. Matthew remained quiet, suspicious, but he didn't dare refuse. Emily was not invited, and I didn't explain the reason to anyone. That night, I tidied the house calmly. I set the table with special dishes, silverware shining under the warm light of the chandeliers. Every detail said, "This matters." When the guests arrived, the hugs and shy smiles covered the tension I felt. Matthew walked among them as if everything were still normal. And for the last time, I let him believe it. The chairs were all occupied. I had my audience. I waited until the last course was served. I waited for the last sip of wine. And then I stood up. I went to the bookshelf and picked up the TV remote. No one understood when the screen turned on and began to display the images recorded by the hidden camera. Gradually, the laughter in the room faded away, replaced by expressions of shock, anger, and disbelief. The whispers ceased. Even breathing seemed suspended. The video spoke for itself. The betrayal, the gestures, the words, everything was projected there, in front of parents, friends, and colleagues. The silence was louder than any scream. The silence was louder than any scream. Matthew stood up, trying to reach for the remote control, but I was faster. "It's not over yet," I said firmly, my voice cutting through the shock in the room. He insisted, claiming that it was private and intimate. Eric stood up as well, and before Matthew could take another step, he stopped him with an outstretched arm. Eric's eyes said it all. "You're not going to escape." The embarrassment was absolute. Some of the guests looked away. Others stared at Matthew as if seeing the true man behind the polished architect for the first time. No one moved. Everyone was trapped in that moment, between shame and incredulity. I approached the table and placed the blue folder on it, with all the printed evidence organized by date. The truth now belonged to all of them. Emily was not there. Not because I spared her, but because she wouldn't have had the strength to endure what was coming. Her absence screamed as loudly as Matthew's presence, as he stood paralyzed between walls that no longer protected him. My mother cried softly. My father stared at nothing. I felt a relief that was not revenge but liberation. For the first time, my pain was not invisible. The lie had been unmasked before everyone who mattered. And there was no way to rebuild the bonds after that. Now everyone knew. The news of the video spread through the city like a wildfire. Days later, Matthew was summoned by the management of his own firm. It didn't take long for the images and reports to cause irreversible damage. He lost clients, lost contracts, and lost prestige. They asked for his departure under the pretext of preserving the company's image. He left in silence without a reaction. As for Emily, she couldn't stand the stares. She went to live with a distant aunt in the countryside. Social media was unforgiving. Public messages and indirect comments swept through their profiles like a gale. And in the midst of it all, I remained silent. I didn't need to say anything. The truth spoke for me. The pain that had isolated me for so long now surrounded them. For the first time, they knew what it was like to be looked at with contempt. Their fall did not give me pleasure, but it brought justice. Eric filed for divorce a few days later. I did the same. The papers were delivered at the same registry office at the same time. A symbolic gesture, silent but full of meaning. Neither of us exchanged words. We didn't need to. Our looks were enough. The family ties were inevitably broken. My mother stopped speaking to Emily. Mutual friends chose their sides. The family was broken. And even among the rubble there was something pure. No one pretended not to know anymore. There was no longer a facade or silence. No one pretended not to know anymore. With the weight of the truth revealed, I decided to take care of what was left of me. I began a new stage of therapy with Dr. Moore, now without the urgency of a crisis, but with the depth of reconstruction. The sessions became my refuge. I cried when I needed to. I fell silent when words didn't come. Gradually, the broken woman was being stitched back together from the inside. And even though the scars would never disappear, they no longer hurt as much. I sold the house where everything happened. I packed up furniture, books, and memories, and left behind the walls that witnessed my fall. The new house was smaller and simple, but full of possibilities. Every room was a new beginning. Every space was a chance to breathe. For the first time, I slept without fear of what I would discover upon waking. The house was now only mine. And that was enough. I changed the keys, the habits, and even the dreams. The pain still lived in me, but in a quieter place. The wound became wisdom. And the past, however cruel it was, no longer defined me. I was starting to rebuild, starting from myself, with truth, with calm, and with self-love. It was the beginning of the end of a story I never chose, but that I now mastered. It was time to rebuild from the rubble. Starting over was scary. The new school was in another neighborhood, with unfamiliar hallways and voices that didn't yet know my name. On the first day, my hands shook as I held the attendance list. But it only took entering the classroom and feeling the curious gaze of the students to remind me of who I was. There was still value in me, even if everything had collapsed. There, in front of the chalkboard, I found my own voice again. With every class, I built a small bridge between the past and the present. My students knew nothing of the woman I had been, nor the pain I carried in my eyes. But they felt my dedication. And that was enough. Over time, the faces began to become familiar, and the silences less heavy. Teaching never ceased to be an exchange, and now I needed that exchange to keep myself whole. I discovered that I could smile even without a great reason. I could enjoy a new book, a new song, or a new version of myself. The mornings stopped being a punishment. The future no longer seemed like a dark tunnel. It was as if every small gesture were a flower blooming from the ashes. I was no longer the same woman who once believed in all the lies. And yet she deserved to be loved. Because deep down, even without realizing it, I was already being reborn. Every classroom was a chance to start over. It was late one afternoon, in the line at a coffee shop near the school, that I heard someone call my name. It was Alex, the therapist I had met during a lecture months before. We talked briefly about simple things until he invited me for coffee. The gesture was discreet, without promises. And yet my heart raced. Not from fear but from hope. I accepted the invitation. We sat near the window, with the golden sun warming our shoulders. We talked about literature, about childhood, and about how life teaches us to rebuild. At a certain point he made such a silly joke that it caught me off guard. And I laughed. A light, spontaneous laugh that I didn't remember how to do. It was then that I realized. It had been a long time since I had smiled like that. Alex didn't try to invade my pain. He simply respected it. And that was more intimate than any confession. At the end of the meeting we exchanged numbers. There was no rush, no plans. Just the opening of a door that I thought I would never cross again. I went home with a strange, sweet calm. As if someone had turned on a light in a room that I had kept closed. It wasn't the beginning of a love story. It was the beginning of a possibility. Perhaps I wouldn't be alone forever. On a rainy afternoon, I ran into Eric by chance in a bookstore. We were in the same section looking for something new when our eyes met. There was surprise but also serenity. We greeted each other like two old survivors of a disaster. We sat in a quiet corner and between coffees and unread pages, we said everything that needed to be said. There was no bitterness between us. Only understanding. He told me that he had started over in another city, with a new job and new habits. I shared my routine at the school, my trips to therapy, and even the meeting with Alex. We laughed together at some moments. We were silent at others. But what marked me most was the lightness of it. For the first time we spoke without carrying shards between our teeth. We said that we didn't regret having loved, but that now we knew that true love requires courage. and respect. We said goodbye with a sincere hug. No strings attached, no pain. Just gratitude for having survived the same earthquake and still being on our feet. That conversation was a closure. Not just of our shared pain, but of everything we left behind. Both had survived the same earthquake. Returning to the old house was like visiting a ghost. The walls were bare, the furniture had been taken away, and the echo of footsteps was the only company. I walked through every room in silence, feeling the weight of the memories without letting them crush me. I touched the doorframe of the bedroom, where I had so often slept crying. I went into the kitchen, where I had served dinners with hands shaking from suspicion. And finally I stopped in front of the front door. With a key I would no longer use, I locked the door one last time. The click of the metal sounded like a final period. There was nothing left there for me. Neither pain nor desire. It was just a place where a part of my story had died. My body remained whole, but my soul needed to be born again. When I left, I didn't look back. Not out of pride, but because I had already moved on. That house taught me what illusion was, but also what strength was. It taught me the difference between silence and submission. And as I left it, I wasn't just saying goodbye to a physical space. I was saying goodbye to the woman I was and the pain I carried for so long. It was a symbolic farewell. A new beginning without applause, but with dignity. Nothing there belonged to me anymore. In the same week, I received an unexpected message. It was from a former student, now an adult, who said she remembered with affection a class about strong women in literature. "You taught me that strength doesn't have to be noise. Sometimes it's just moving forward," the text said. I smiled as I read it. Her words touched a deep place in me. Because despite everything, I continued to be someone who left marks, good marks. The message arrived on the day I was questioning my worth. And it was the answer I didn't even know I needed. It didn't come from public applause or stamped proof. It came from who I was when no one was looking. To be remembered not for the pain I lived, but for the strength I demonstrated unintentionally, was the greatest gift. It was the confirmation that my essence remained alive. It wasn't Matthew who defined me, nor Emily, nor the pain. My worth was in the silent choices, the discreet new beginnings, and the words I planted in every student. I was not what they did to me. I was what I did with it. And as much as I suffered, none of it destroyed me. On the contrary, it strengthened me. My value didn't come from them. It came from me. That night, I sat before my old diary. The cover was already worn, the pages full of memories. I flipped through the pages with tears in my eyes, not of sadness but of pride. I read passages where I doubted myself, where I felt empty, and where I didn't know if I would have the strength to continue. And then I wrote the last sentence. The truest one. The one that would free me forever. If I could go back, I would do it all again. Because every choice, every silence, and every strategy brought me here. Because by falling, I discovered the strength to get back up. Because I loved, I was betrayed, and even so, I didn't lose the ability to trust. Because I transformed pain into courage and chaos into clarity. Because I reconnected with myself and discovered that, yes, I deserve peace. And more. I deserve love, the true kind, starting with myself. I closed the diary with firm hands. And in doing so, I knew that no part of this story was in vain. That even the wounds had a purpose. And that not all betrayals hurt forever. Some set us free. Some save us. And this was my salvation. Not through the pain but through the choice to continue. Because some betrayals set us free. Now I am curious about you who heard my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever gone through something similar? Support the channel by subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing this video. I am leaving another story on the end screen that you will also like, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. Until the next video.